You've probably heard of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. It's, a giant of 20th century literature. For 100 years, we've basically thought we had it figured out. It's all about the trauma of war, a culture falling apart. But what if this iconic poem is actually hiding a different story? A secret story about a global catastrophe that history has tried to forget.
Right from the start, Eliot hits you with this chilling line, and immediately it just throws you into this world of broken images, shattered bodies, and this deep nagging anxiety. The whole thing just feels bleak. It feels like the aftermath of some huge, unspoken trauma. But the question is, which one?
And for, about 100 years, the answer to that question seemed totally obvious. I mean, the poem came out in 1922, just a few years after World War I wrapped up. The scars of that war were still so fresh, and its trauma seemed to be stamped on every single line. The connection just felt undeniable.
Oh man, critics have written libraries worth of books on this. It's been read as a reaction to the war's devastation, a takedown of cultural decay, a deep dive into Eliot's own personal demons, you name it. And that famous, choppy, fragmented style, everyone thought, yep, that's it. That's the perfect mirror for a shattered post-war world.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. This is the big puzzle. The Great War was horrific, killing millions. But another catastrophe, one that was actually deadlier, was sweeping the globe at the exact same time, the 1918 Spanish flu. Think about that. It hit 1/3 of the entire planet's population. And yet, in a century of analyzing this poem, it's been almost completely ignored.
So why the silence? Well, it all comes down to how we remember things, and maybe more importantly, how we forget them. Turns out, not all tragedies get an equal spot in our cultural memory, and the difference between how we remember a war versus a pandemic is just stark.
And this difference is absolutely crucial. You see, war, as horrific as it is, can be turned into a story of heroism, of collective sacrifice. We build giant public memorials, we create this grand national narrative. But a pandemic? No way. That's a whole different beast. It's a quiet, individual battle. It makes people feel helpless, not heroic. There's no grand story, just a private, isolating tragedy that tends to just fade away.
Okay, so if the pandemic was pretty much erased from the cultural conversation, how on earth do we find it in the poem? Well, we have to put on our detective hats and look at the man himself, at the biographical evidence connecting Eliot directly to the virus.
And what you find is, whoa, the Spanish flu was not just some distant headline for T.S. Eliot. He and his wife both got sick with it in December of 1918. And get this, for the next 3 years, the exact time he's writing The Wasteland, they were just trapped in this horrible cycle of sickness, exhaustion, recovery, and relapse, which all led to Eliot having a complete nervous breakdown. The virus was a constant, inescapable part of his life.
And it's not just speculation. We have it in his own words. In a letter, he describes this new form of influenza and its very specific, awful symptoms, an extreme dryness and a bitter taste. That's not some abstract idea. That's a deeply physical, horrible feeling.
And it went deeper than just the physical sickness. He actually started using pandemic language to describe his whole life. He called his incredibly strained marriage the long epidemic of domestic influenza. The virus wasn't just in his body, it had infected his home, his relationships, and his mind.
So, okay, once you have this viral context in your head, the poem it transforms. Its weird, jumpy structure suddenly clicks into place if you stop seeing it as a battlefield and start seeing it as something more like the transcript of a fever dream.
And the key to unlocking this is something scholars call delirium logic. When you have a really high fever, it does more than make you ache. It completely shatters your thoughts. You can have hallucinations, your whole sense of reality just falls apart. All of a sudden, the poem's constant jumps in time, its jumble of different voices, it all makes perfect sense as the product of a feverish, delirious mind.
All right, let's test this out. Let's take a look at this incredibly vivid image from the poem. For decades, the standard reading was that this is a symbol for, spiritual drought or emptiness. But now, look at it through that pandemic lens. It's suddenly a terrifyingly literal description of a body just wrecked by fever, that extreme dryness and overwhelming thirst that Eliot himself wrote about. It's the raw, physical agony of the flu, right there on the page.
Okay, here's another huge one from the poem's big climax. For a long time, this was seen as a purely spiritual crisis, a reference to Buddhist and Christian holy texts.
But what if it's also a gut-wrenchingly perfect description of your body literally feeling like it's on fire from a raging fever? It's not just a crisis of the soul, it's a crisis of the body. And in 1922, that feeling would have been painfully, horribly familiar to millions of people.
The poem is also full of these really specific sounds, right? Like the tolling of London church bells. But he describes the sound as dead, a detail that people usually interpreted as a comment on the death of religious faith.
But in the context of a pandemic, that sound becomes something else entirely. During the Spanish flu, church bells rang constantly, tolling for the dead. This dead sound wasn't some faint echo from a battlefield in France. It was the non-stop soundtrack of the plague right outside your window, a sound that seeped into every sick room in the city.
So look, reading the poem this way isn't just some fun literary game. It helps explain why the poem was so deeply haunting to its very first readers, and, frankly, why it hits so close to home for us now.
You know, we've always talked about how fragmented this poem is. It's like its defining feature. But what if we've been looking at the wrong explosion all along? A virus doesn't just attack cells, it shatters everything. Our thoughts, our memories, our communities, our stories. Maybe the poem's broken pieces aren't shrapnel from a bomb, but from a virus.
And this is where literature is just so powerful, right? It can capture the feelings and experiences that the official history books just miss. Eliot, maybe without even fully realizing it, was channeling this massive collective trauma of the pandemic, giving a voice to a kind of suffering that was everywhere but was too personal, too isolating to even talk about.
So when you look at it this way, The Wasteland becomes something new. It becomes the great, maybe unintentional, memorial to the 1918 pandemic. It's a monument not just to a broken culture, but to broken bodies and to the immense suffering that history chose to forget.
And all of this really leaves us with one last, pretty urgent question. A century after The Wasteland, we've all just lived through our own global pandemic. What parts of our experience are going to be remembered? What will get the public memorials? And what parts will be silenced, left for the artists and poets to try and capture? 100 years from now, how will they tell our story?